As everyone is logging in, first of all, I'd like to welcome each of you to the Yakima Chief Hops 2021 Harvest discussion, and as well as a technical discussion. My name is Jim Lambert. I'm the Director of Business Development for Asia here at Yakima Chief Hops, and I warmly welcome each of you. We appreciate your time. We appreciate your attendance. And tonight, I think you're going to be, or at least tonight here in the States, and then the morning on your side, you're going to enjoy this seminar that we're hosting. Quickly, I'll make some introductions for everyone so you're familiar with the speakers. Our first will be our Global Chief Sales and Marketing Officer, Bryan Pierce. Bryan will give us a nice harvest discussion and a recap of what's going on as we're closing in to the finishing time for the Pacific Northwest harvest of hops. Afterwards, we're going to have a bit of a technical discussion by Josh Biersbacher, the Mid-Atlantic Regional Sales Manager for Yakima Chief Hops. He will be joined by three excellent panelists here from around the region. The first being John Way. John is the founder and yeast whisperer at Brewlander. And something very interesting that for John, when he was endorsed as the Asian representative for Beer Judge Certificate Program, or the BGCP in 2015, and has since been a regular examination proctor in the examinations. Secondarily, we have Andrew Gamble from Guerrilla Brewing in Busan, South Korea, and he is the lead brewer there. Probably one of the more interesting things about Andrew and his excellent bio is that to get his job, he brought a hand-sculpted banana to the owner, Paul Edwards, as an interview bribe, which I particularly found very fascinating. And our last one will be Shiro Yamada with Far Yeast Brewery in Japan. Shiro is the founder and managing director there. Far Yeast was started as a contract brewery, interestingly enough, with no physical brewery, but ended up with established 30HL Brewhouse Brewery in Yamanashi in Japan in 2017. So with our distinguished panelists, we are extremely honored. And with that, I'll turn this over to Bryan Pierce for the initial discussion on the hop harvest.
All right, hello everyone. Thanks Jim for the introduction, and I'll echo what Jim said as a big welcome to everyone who's joining us. I think as we all know, we're a little sad we're not having more of these discussions in person this year. But we do think it's very important that we are able to still bring information from the Pacific Northwest out to everyone around the globe. And so we have, I think, a really great discussion here ahead of us. And my hope is, and I think what I'm really excited about with this discussion is that we are wrapping up really closely here to the end of our harvest season. So I probably have the best information I've had all harvest season now on how things went, because we're almost done with it. So I'm going to go through just some different slides here and kind of give some updates. And I will also, we'll have some time for any questions or anything like that specifically on the harvest. Because, you know, as we wrap things up here, I think we'll be able to answer some of those pretty well. So, so with that, before we dive into any of the details, I do want to talk a little bit about Yakima Chief Hops and our company and who we are. And first off, I want to really highlight our mission. And our mission is to connect family hop farms with the world's finest brewers, really providing the highest quality hop products and uncompromising service for the ultimate benefit of our customers, employees, and growers. And I really see this conversation being a big part of that. You know, we're trying to find the connections any way we can, even if it means we got to jump on Zoom calls and talk halfway around the world. We want to make sure people understand what's going on here in the Pacific Northwest. Also, our vision is to be the global hop supplier of choice. We want our passion for preserving the planet, treating people with respect and dignity, and our commitment to healthy communities to be reflected in every beer brewed with our hops. And lastly, our values. And we often talk about these as our pride statement, as you can probably see on the screen, the PRIDE for pride, which is passion, respect, integrity, dedication, and excellence. And really, to highlight a couple of these and not spend too much time on this, first off is our passion for people, product, and planet. You know, we really want to focus, again, bringing all this information to everyone, wherever you might be today. Our integrity is specifically in transparency. I think it's really important that we give crop updates and that people are aware of how harvest has gone here, maybe what variables were ahead of us going into harvest, how that played out, and any information around, you know, what's been happening on the farms. And how that may affect you or your plans for the rest of your in your brewery. And lastly is just excellence. You know, we really want to put the time and energy in bringing that information out to you. So go ahead and sorry, you can change it. Yeah. A little bit about Yakima Chief Hops. We are a 100% grower-owned hop company, which is really unique. It's for us, we're the largest U.S. hop-based company, and being grower-owned is a big part of that. The different people you see on the screen here, there's 14 different families, family farms. They are all the owners of our organization. And specifically of those families, I wanted to point out Steve Peralt, who's kind of down in the center middle there, Mike Smith, who is right above him, as well as Craig Carpenter, his father, actually, Tom Carpenter. Craig's the representative on the slide here, but those three families were our founding families. And 34 years ago, this year was Yakima Chief Hop's founding. And it was really those three families coming together and saying, we want to start an organization that's really a balance of supply and demand and being grower owned and what that means to the industry. So since then, we've gone through a lot of changes, and that's where you see all the other owners on this slide. Some of them are in Oregon, some of them are in Washington. But I think what's really important to highlight in that is we receive hops from a lot more than just these 14 family farms. We are really here, you know, when I say connecting brewers and growers around the world, we want to connect all growers with all brewers. And so you can see on there, we actually work with 50 different family farms across the entire Pacific Northwest. The 14 families on the slide here that you see represent a significant portion of our volume, but we actually have even more hops coming from the rest of the farms around Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. So just a little bit in case you've maybe never been here or you're maybe just not as familiar with it, wanted to give a little overview of the growing region. So first off, you know, today where I am, where Jim is, where Josh is sitting, we're in Washington, we're in Yakima, Washington today. And Washington is responsible for the growth of over 75% of all the hops in the United States. But you might hear of Yakima or you hear about Washington being this hop state, but there's actually really distinct regions within the Yakima Valley where most of our hops are grown. And that is Moxie, or what people here would often refer to as East Valley. So it's kind of the very far east side of the valley. Lower Valley, which is south of our Union Gap here. So it's kind of a lower portion that reaches all the way down to almost the Columbia River. And then in the Lower Valley, we also have the Yakima Nation or Yakima Native Reservation. And there's actually a significant portion of hops grown within the nation as well. And those three areas are kind of the distinct growing regions within Yakima, Washington. In total of those three regions, there's about 43,000 acres of hops grown, which is pretty significant. And then Oregon is actually the third largest growing region. Most of the hops in Oregon are grown in the Willamette Valley, which I'm sure many of you are probably familiar with. Willamette, the hop, the Willamette Valley is where all those hops are grown. And there are some, like Willamette, hops that are very distinct or uniquely grown within that growing region, just because the environment there is a little different. Yakima, Washington is considered a high desert. It's a lot of sagebrush, shrub steppe environment. The Willamette Valley has a much higher, humidity, moisture. They get rain. It's a lot greener there. And so some hops tend to do a little better in that environment. Other hops tend to be a little more challenged in that environment. And Oregon has historically been the second largest growing region. But 2 years ago, Idaho became now the second largest growing region in the Pacific Northwest. And most of those hops are grown just west of Nampa, Idaho. And you can see there's about 9,700 acres of hops grown in Idaho as well. And really, I have to kind of make a statement here. Idaho has really shown up on the map big time over the last couple of years in hop growing and hop quality, and really giving everyone else in Oregon and Washington quite a run for their money when it comes to some of the awesome aromas and flavors coming out of Idaho. So of that acreage, a couple of things I want to kind of go through here is this is actually information that's compiled by the USDA and Hop Growers of America. And is really just a review. Every year they look at what are the top 10 varieties grown in the United States by acreage. So I don't have acreage numbers on this graph here, but what you can see is just what is the top, all the way down through the 10th. And what you'll see on this graph is that since 2016, there's been some really big shifts going on in certain varieties. And a lot of this is really driven by consumers' taste, by beer styles, and also how that translates to brewers and what varieties they're using, what's driving the flavors, and new things like any IPA or hazy beer versus West Coast IPA versus lagers and things like that. And so you can see if you go 5 years ago, or almost 6 years ago now, back in 2016, Cascade was the #1 grown hop in the United States by acreage, followed by Centennial, and then CTZ, which is primarily grown for alpha use on a global scale. And you can see even in 2016, Citro, Simcoe, Mosaic were just 4th, 5th, and 6th, shortly followed by Chinook, and then Summit, Willamette, and Apollo, which are hops you see falling really quite significantly out of common usage around the globe. And if you fast forward to today, you'll see that Citra is now the most grown hop by acreage, and it has been now for the last 3 years, and that will continue to be the case. It continues to have further expansion here in the Pacific Northwest. CTZ has bumped up quite a bit as being a really primary alpha source in a lot of the global markets supplied out of the US, versus alpha that maybe is grown in Germany with things like Hercules and stuff like that. And then you also have Mosaic and Simcoe now rounding out, numbers 3 and 4. But what you'll see is that Cascade is shifted significantly down to spots 5, and Centennial down to spot 6. Chinook falling pretty low on this graph here. And again, I want to point out that this is really following usage in the beer industry. But what's important to note about that is that those varieties have been really core varieties for craft beer on a global scale for many, many years. And we're seeing this unique time where suddenly the amount of them being grown in the United States is at an all-time low. And so it's something to take note of. And so with that information, to kind of just get to probably what you really wanted to hear about, which is how harvest is going right now, is harvest started really strong this year. There was a lot of concerns. Early in June this year, we had some unseasonably warm heat. To give you an idea, here in Washington, we saw a day or two of temperatures almost up to 48 degrees Celsius. So really warm for here. It's very hot here normally, not normally that hot. And at the same time in in Oregon and Idaho, we saw some really high heat. They got up to about 37 degrees Celsius, which is also very warm, and especially for Oregon in a much wetter climate. But they didn't get it quite as high, but they saw that heat for a much longer period of time. So I know in Idaho, they had 2 weeks of that daily, which is also not normal for that growing region. The timing in June is right around the time that a lot of early varieties start beginning their flowering, which then ultimately turns into cone setting and kind of really sets up what the yields are going to look like come harvest time. So there were some really big concerns about hops getting a lot of pressure from the heat and that having some negative effects on yield. And early on, we even saw some plants that the tops of the plants actually kind of got burned where the plant wasn't able to cycle the water up high enough and fast enough to deal with the heat. So there was a lot of discussion back in June about that. And what I can confidently say is that has not had a huge effect on our harvest this year, very fortunately. We saw some hops actually thrive really well with the heat. We saw others that were maybe a little challenged, but as always, growers are constantly battling the agricultural side of things. And we saw where they would take sidearms off some hops where the tops were burned and actually retrain those so that the plant would still reach its top of the trellis. So fortunately, it hasn't had a huge impact on yields. And to skip one of my points here, quality has been really excellent across the board, which is also really good. Kind of the two major concerns: are we going to have enough hops, and are they going to be really good? They both have been really strong, so that's been positive. What I will say is we have seen some variation from farm to farm in that. So some farms, had some yield concerns this year. Others had excellent years. And in the aggregate for Yakima Chief hops and working with over 50 different farms, we're getting in what we expect to get in this year, which is really good news for everyone. So another big topic this year was smoke. Last year, or really a carryover from 2020, and smoke having such a huge effect on hops last year. I think the industry saw, in hops and in beer, a large effect on varieties like Mosaic and Citra in 2020, as well as other maybe less, common use varieties like Crystal and things like that. And we had some really big fires this year locally in Washington burning that had some really big effects really from July all the way into the harvest season. And we were very fortunate this year that we actually had some early rain that really helped mitigate a lot of that for the Yakima Valley. The smoke here was carrying all the way over into Idaho, fortunately not really into Oregon, which was good. And so we have seen a little bit of smoke have effect on a few hops, but nothing near the effect we saw in 2020. So again, my takeaway from that and what we've seen so far is that it's not really going to have a big cause for concern this year in hops or for brewers. So another big feature of this year is a little bit of avoiding a major deal like we had last year. So. And then again, I just wanted to point out, with some of that variability, what we're seeing, is the importance of pointing back to the previous slide of Cascade, Centennial, and Chinook acreage trends going down. Is that as we see more and more variability, like we have this year, having smaller amounts of those varieties in the ground means that they will have larger effects when there's yield issues and things like that. So there's less of a pool to draw from. So a little bit of a caution in that, and in what we're seeing, in kind of the importance of, if you're looking for those hops, the importance of talking to hop suppliers about making sure you're projecting those needs into the future with contracts, or making sure that those are known. So. All right, to dive a little bit into varieties and let everyone know kind of where we are at the moment. We are currently, we're just wrapping up Citra and Mosaic. Actually, we're really in the last week here. Citra is now complete, so a little different than what was on the slide here. Mosaic is also now complete. And then Simcoe, Cascade, Centennial, Sabro, Idaho Gem are also complete. Those are all early varieties. So a lot of those were actually completed in the first week and a half to 2 weeks of September. And then Amarillo, Azaka, Chinook, and Cashmere, well over the halfway mark now. I'm expecting some of the last bales to come in. And then right now we're really moving into this week, Idaho 7, CTZ, Pato. So although Idaho 7 is an aroma variety, also has a lot of high alpha. And so a lot of the high alpha hops are really being harvested right now. We're also expecting to get a lot of our Eldorado in this week as well. So we are wrapping it up. This is really officially the last week of harvest. And so Oregon is already done. It says getting done this week, but actually is totally complete at this point. And then Washington and Idaho, like I said, we're really in that last stretch right now. Most farms will be done picking by this Saturday, or October 2nd. One feature we did see this year was kind of unique with harvest, is that our timing was a little off, which I think is a little bit related to what I mentioned around variability and yields and things like that. Is we did see some pick windows for some of these varieties shift a little bit. Normally, most farms would start on Centennial or Simcoe and then move into Cascades and then move into Sabro, and then quickly from there into some of the other breakouts of whatever might be on their farm. And what we saw this year is farms that normally start on Simcoe maybe had to shift and instead start on their Cascades, or normally would start on Centennial and instead decided to start on Simcoe. And a lot of that had to just do with, again, maturity and being ready on time. So a little bit of that variability. Because of that, harvest has, we've kind of arbitrarily said a little bit, felt like it's about 1 to 2 days behind a normal year. And so although we are in the last couple of days, and October 2nd will be the finish for most people, there are a few farms right now that are really being challenged to make sure all the hops are completely in before we really start getting some pretty cold weather and before it becomes pretty late. And so we have seen some farms who are already complete reaching out to other growers and asking if they can help run some of their hops, just to make sure that hops are totally in the barn without having to worry about any quality issues. So kind of a cool feature of a bunch of growers in a small community. Although they all grow, they all compete on quality and compete on yields and who has the best. If you've ever gotten to know a grower or a farm at any level, there's always a little sense of competition. But at the end of the day, when it really matters, everyone's out there helping each other as much as they can and want to see each other be successful. So yeah, that's kind of a recap here of variety by variety and what we're seeing.
So Brian, we have a question here regarding to the aroma and flavors. Does the warming temperature has any effect on these kind of things?
We haven't seen any direct effects. Are you talking just like on a global scale warming? Is that the question, David? I didn't see it. I'm sorry. If that is.
Yes, it's in the chat. Yeah, it's.
Okay.
How does global warming affect hop aroma or flavors going forward?
Oh, okay.
It has been changing how winemakers harvest and wine in general. Just wondering its effects on hops.
Perfect. Okay. Yeah. So I think directly any changes in temperature are something that hasn't been significantly seen. Although I will say the biggest effect it probably has here in the Pacific Northwest is that it does affect snowpacks, rainfalls, and ultimately just water availability. And what we've seen and what we're very fortunate to have here in the Pacific Northwest is almost all of our hop acreage is irrigated. So unlike other growing regions around the world that rely a lot more on Mother Nature to provide water for plants, we have a lot more control over that. But that does mean that, if we go years and years of having drier summers, less snowpack in the mountains, and, the filling of a lot of the reservoirs that supply a lot of that, that there could be long-term challenges with that. But immediately, and I would say even in the very near future, that is not a very top of mind concern. Although it's something we talk a lot about because hops use a lot of water, it's not something that we're very concerned about having any immediate impacts. From flavor and aroma though, and exposure to heat, a lot of the heat we get is in the summer, and that's before a lot of the cones are formed. I mentioned it's a lot of the heat we had in June, or even if it was into July at all, is right around the flowering portion, but it's not around cone setting, which is really where a lot of your oils and everything become developed in the hop cones. That happens in the fall, really end of August, early September. So we haven't seen any effects on that, but it's definitely something we have discussions around for sure. So lastly, just what does this all mean for you as a brewer? First and foremost, it means that if you have contracts, I would expect full fulfillment this year. There's no concerns around having to be short on anything. But hops are in a very sold position. Like I mentioned, with some of that variation in yield and things like that, we got what we expected, but it doesn't mean we got more than what we expected. So I would definitely expect less spot volumes throughout this year. Especially on certain varieties that are really high in interest right now, like Citra, Mosaic, Simcoe, Cascade, Centennial, and Chinook, especially because of some of the acreage stuff we discussed, as well as other varieties like Cashmere even, where there's just going to be a tighter position because there's less in than a normal year. So what to do with that information is know that if you have that taken care of on a contract or with the hop supplier, you'll be in a good spot. If you don't, I would definitely be asking questions around that as soon as possible to make sure that those needs are anticipated. And then where you have big needs into the future and seeing some of those acreage trends, I would continue to plan on talking about future opportunities and communicating those things early so that we can make acreage adjustments accordingly. In a normal year, right after harvest, and even right now, we're already discussing acreage changes for 2022 harvest. Do we need more of something else? Do we need less of something? So starting to think about that as well. I know that's very far off into the future, but at a brewery, starting to think about those things now are really important because the earlier you can communicate that, the faster the hop industry can react to it. So with that, I think that's sort of a wrap of kind of my update on how things are looking here in the Pacific Northwest.
There is a question in the chat. For Citra and Mosaic, is it possible to have YCH a new contract with new customers?
Yes, I would always ask, as much as I say that things are tight or they may not be available, our inventories are often adjusting. There's times where someone maybe reaches out to us and says, I don't have a need for this anymore. And so we're always looking for where we can make sure hops find their way into a beer successfully. So I would always ask, we're always looking to obviously work with everyone. And so reach out to your local sales rep on that for sure. All right. Well, with that, I'm going to step out and I'll be hanging around. So if there are any other questions regarding harvest, otherwise, I appreciate everyone's time and letting me give you updates on how things are going here. Again, I wish we could be having this conversation in person and sharing a beer together over this conversation, but I look forward to that maybe in the 2022 harvest update. So with that, we'll turn it over to Josh and we'll move into our next topic here.
Right. Biotransformation. This is a subject that I've been very interested in over the last few months. I don't have a chemist. I've been asking a lot of really smart people about the different ways that a lot of these compounds interact with each other. By definition, the interaction of a hop compound, which can lead to a new aromatic compound through a metabolic reaction. There's several compounds that have biotransformational properties, but the four that we really want to focus on are geraniol and linalool. Geraniol, linalool, nerol, and citronellol are all four considered part of the rose oil family. They are all chemically similar, and they also are, from an aroma standpoint, very synergistic. Geraniol has huge potential to interact with yeast and transform into linalool and citronellol. Citronellol and nerol are found in very trace amounts in hops, and through biotransformation, we can really increase the amount of these compounds in a finished beer, especially citronellol. If you're looking for big citrusy orange juice flavors, which I think are kind of the definitive aroma profile of a New England IPA, biotransformation is definitely the best way to go. Next slide, please. Some considerations are, different does not always mean better. Although in the case of these compounds that we're talking about today, I do think that there is a huge benefit from trying to really pull a lot of these flavors out where you normally wouldn't find them from just dry hopping at the end of fermentation. Varietal selection is a big consideration. You want to have a variety with not only a lot of, but a good balance of high levels of monoterpene alcohol styles and esters. It can create some issues with yeast handling. Dry hopping a actively fermenting beer can make harvesting certain yeast strains very difficult. And safety, as a former brewer, safety was always the first part of every conversation. And when you have a brewer up on a scissor lift or on a ladder, dry hopping a actively fermenting tank, you need to be very careful that you don't have a gushing tank on your hands. Next slide. So as a former brewer, I love this chart. I think it's an extremely useful tool. I encourage everyone to have this available in your office when you're creating hop recipes. Here internally, we've discovered these 7 compounds that we found are water soluble. I would say that if you take anything away from this presentation, solubility is very important. Especially in terms of geraniol and linalool, there's a lot of research on these compounds, and you can see on the chart certain hops are very high in these compounds. You look at Centennial, huge loads of methylgeronate. Idaho 7 has a wonderful balance of these compounds, making it a great hot side addition, as well as Mosaic and Citra. And then if you look at the other end of the chart, you can see that Cascade has quite a bit lower levels of these compounds, meaning that they are you're going to get the most bang for your buck using them at the end of fermentation. That's not to say you can't use some of these lower volume hops in hot side, but if you want to get the most out of your money, it's best to use them closer to the end of fermentation. Next slide, please. So the use of highly survivable hops early in the brewing process is really going to help you front load your wort stream with a lot of these desirable compounds. I preach about geraniol and linalool, but there's also 3-mercaptahexanol and methylgeronate. I mean, all of these will give you really nice flavors, and they all are very synergistic with one another. You can see that Idaho 7, again, has a really nice balance of these compounds, meaning that if you were to use it in the whirlpool, you're going to get a appropriate volume in your wort stream before fermentation to increase your ability for biotransformation. You can also look at Centennial and see that there are huge amounts of methylgeronate, and it's real important for us to say that quantity does not always mean quality. You really want a balanced amount of these compounds if you're trying to get big, juicy, citrusy beers. Next slide, please. And again, if you look at the other end of the chart, cashmere, which I think is a great hop and has great flavor, it's not going to benefit you using that in the whirlpool. It will benefit you using it at the end of fermentation. And that's what this chart, I love this chart. I share it with all my friends whenever they're making beer recipes. Next slide. And I'm a big believer in blending hops. Availability is not always a guarantee. And also by blending hops, you can create more dynamic flavor profiles. If you look at Laurel, it has a huge amount of linalool. And if you look at Tallus, it has a huge amount of geraniol. Using this hop combination will give you a synergistic and more dynamic flavor profile. Whereas if you were to use linalool, which is high in Laurel, which is high in linalool, and Crystal, which is high in linalool, you're going to have a very one-dimensional kind of flavor note. Next slide, please. So again, if you take anything away, solubility, you want to get these water-soluble compounds early in your wort stream, preferably in the whirlpool, so maintain as much aroma as possible. And by using a combination of different hops, you can maximize the potential for different flavors. So as an example, on this slide, you can see Idaho 7 Simcoe, and Sabro all make great whirlpool additions. And they also make great mid-fermentation additions. And by using multi-hop approach, I really think you can maximize your flavor potential, especially if we're talking about New England style IPAs. Next slide, please. So we designed a product called Cryopop. Cryopop is born of beer-soluble hop compounds. We created a cryo product that is a blend of hops that have a good balance of these compounds. This is meant to be a tool to help brewers maximize concentrations of the most impactful hop compound. This is a great tool for brewers who maybe aren't sure where to start when it comes to doing IPAs, and it's also just a great one-stop shop for whirlpool and mid-fermentation. Next slide. So you can see on the graph, Cryopop is just ahead of Idaho 7, but just below Centennial. Again, if you look at Centennial, it has a huge slug of methyl germinate, which quantity does not equal quality. With Cryopop, we really try to give you a very balanced combination of these flavors to really create big, juicy, fruit-forward beers. Next slide. Again, it's, if you're just looking for a go-to solution, this is a great product. It's also very user-friendly, especially in the whirlpool, to help increase your efficiency. Brewers focused on maximizing contributions from individual hop compounds. It's very strategic. And if maybe you have an IPA and it's just not, the aroma and the flavor is just not quite where you need to be, this is a great compound to help supercharge those flavors, especially in using it early. I've also used it as a dry hop with really good success. Any questions for Cryopop or the survivable compounds research? All right. Well, now is a good time for us to get started with our panelists. You guys have been sitting there idly. Very happy to have you guys here. I think we have some good questions, and hopefully the audience will join in and offer a few more questions for us.
So, Josh, let me ask some questions because previously I've prepared some questions for discussions. So let me start with asking each and every one of you about these days right now. Just real quick, if you can share with us with your COVID experience right now in Korea, Japan, and Singapore, just like very short. Would you start with us sharing your experience, Yamada-san, about Japan? Just real quick about what did you do?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, as you know, the COVID-19 is not very present. We have been, experiencing a difficult, years. So for us, draft beers, draft cakes are still, disaster. Many restaurants and beer pubs are not operating even now. So it was not good, but we are now focusing on packaging beer, like, canned beer, like, this stuff. Yeah, we installed the, canning line 2 years ago, and we are now, increasing packaging product. Many of the customers, many of the beer fans, want to buy craft beers at the convenience stores or supermarket, and we are now trying to, cultivate a new market. Yep, for international development, we are gonna open up a new tap room in Taipei in almost 2 weeks from now. October 16, we are gonna have a tap room in Taipei, and then we have done the collaboration with Taiwanese brewery called Ugly Half. So this is our newest, limited one-off collaboration beer with Ugly Half. This is lychee, hazy, kind of IPA, fruited hazy IPA. Yep. Hopefully, in Taiwan, the COVID-19 situation is much better than Japan. So hopefully we can, get the new customers there and, interact with new, local breweries and, kind of stuff. Yeah, that's it for us.
Look forward to it. So what about you, John? Do you have any experience sharing with us real quick about Singapore right now?
Yeah, I think pretty much the same for most Southeast Asia, right? All the bars and restaurants go through periods of, tightening or closure or not being able to serve people dining in. So draft sales are definitely quite low, but for breweries or for suppliers that went in early onto the retail front or have some form of e-commerce play, right? I think they are able to weather this unusual situation much better. Interestingly enough as well, like since last year and this year, right? A lot of people are stuck at home, right? And you can't go out, you can't dine in, right? So people are a little bit more open to trying different styles of beers, trying beers from different breweries, right? So I think that really helped to a certain extent, the local craft players reaching out to a new group of consumers who just thought, I've tried so many different beers already, let me just try something different. So I think that was a good thing, right? So when things started to open up a little bit, right, this new group of consumers do actually go to craft beer bars or restaurants that they have not been to, but because of their newfound interest in craft beer, right, they're starting to go out a little bit more. But right now in Singapore, we've just tightened again for 1 month. So, I think draft sales would still be a little bit challenging. I think gradually it should come back, at least for Singapore, right? Because we are right now, I think 82% vaccinated. So yeah, fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. So what about Korea, Andrew? Would you share a little bit?
Korea's never really had a true lockdown, but they've put a lot of restrictions on, of course, the bars and stuff that affected our draft sales, just like everybody else. And very quickly, Paul moved to the canning and the packaging. We do both canning and bottling. So that helped us survive earlier this year because of the drop in the draft sales. But now there's quite a healthy increase in the draft sales again, as well as the packaging. So we're really looking forward to Korea. They've said that their plan is to really release the restrictions on the bars and restaurants by the end of October because of this 80% line that everybody's talking about for vaccinations. And if that happens, I think we can start the beginning of the end of this pandemic freeze on all of the businesses, and we can look forward to normal business again.
Gotcha. Thank you. Thank you for sharing this with your experience. So let's go to some discussions about it. So I have a question here regarding about New England IPAs. So Josh, you mentioned about you need to blend multiple varieties to increase the hoppy aromas in the New England IPA, right? So how many varieties should one be using? And is there a limit, or what's your experiences using this? And this is for all the panelists. I would like to hear Josh first for your answer.
I would say it comes to the brewer. I mean, 2 hops would be fine, but personally, I would usually create recipes with 4 to 5 hops, and that would be whirlpool hop, maybe 2 whirlpool hops, and then a blend of mid-firm and end-of-firm. The reason that we do that is just in case one of those hops is no longer available, then we're able to pivot to something else, and we don't completely change what we would consider to be, a true to brand flavor.
So with that being said, but a single hop is not possible for doing the New England IPAs. Is that?
Anything is possible as long as you're creative. I do think you get more dynamic flavors from using multiple hops, but I've definitely had some single hop varieties. I've had some single hop cryopop beers that were very interesting, super pineapple forward. So anything's possible.
Okay. So John, what do you think about this?
I think biotransformation is a subject. It's a you know, dependent on a lot of variables, right, or a lot of different things that come into play. You know, I think first of all, you know, a lot depends on the polyphenols from the malts. Then again, the active, I mean you know, the selection of the yeast that you use. So I think some yeast will not actually promote biotransformation, right? So I think there's certain kind of yeast. Typically, it seems like typically British varietals or British strains of yeast helps with that biotransformation. Timing of when you add the hops as well. So like what Josh shared earlier, certain compounds that you want to be present in the wort first. So kind of like aids as a precursor, right, to encourage that biotransformation. Timing of the hops as well. And one question for Josh though. You mentioned to add the cryo pulp, right? But given that how polyphenols, both malts and hops polyphenols are important in its role for the biotransformation, do you see a big difference whether using T90s, even that small hop material, versus cryo, which has those hop materials actually removed?
I honestly haven't seen a huge difference. I think the biggest difference that we saw were that there was less grassy flavors using cryo because there's less bract material, more concentrated lupulin glands. And I think the biggest thing that we saw was the efficiency out of the whirlpool, because when you're doing big hop charges in the whirlpool, you can lose a lot of beer. So cryo is definitely a great solution for that.
I think, yeah, sorry. I think one thing that recently people talk a little bit about is the thiols. So not just esters production from the biotransformation, but also the thiols. Am I pronouncing it right? THIOLS.
Yep.
I think some people are adding some enzymes to actually help convert certain compounds, you know, to encourage that passion fruit, gooseberry, slightly, you know, like some very nice fruity flavors that you would enjoy in a glass of white wine as well.
One of the compounds we identified was 3-mercaptahexanol, and it's detectable in parts per trillion, and that's a polyfunctional thiol. It also has some biotransformational abilities to turn into 3 and 4-H. In parts per trillion, you get grapefruit, blackcurrant, gooseberry flavors. So I definitely, you know, I've seen some thiol, what we call thiol bombs, happening here in the States quite a bit.
Is it thiol bomb or
just like the more thiols in the beer I've seen, they tend to take on like a grape juice kind of character, like a white grape Sauvignon Blanc flavor.
Oh, okay. So let's move on. So Yamada-san, do you have any ideas on this about how many varieties you use in your New England IPAs?
Yep. Actually, we are not very, you know, IPA focused brewery, but you know, we brewed quite a few, you know, hazy or juicy IPAs before. Then one of them are, you know, kind of very survivals and biotransformation focus, the juicy IPA. We used, you know, cryopop, Idaho 7 for Walpo. And then early dry hop, we use Mosaic and Citra and Talos. And the same for the second dry hop, late dry hop. This was quite successful since, you know, cryopop is definitely, you know, work very well in a hot side addition. And also, you know, Talas is the, you know, maybe key hop for, you know, for our juicy IPA, since Talas is one of the few geranium-rich hops. I don't find any other, you know, geranium-rich hops like Talas. Maybe Sabro has some geranium too, but Talas has a bigger impact. So I think that makes you know, good accent on the juicy IPA, and I think this is kind of very interesting experience. For, you know, the question about how many variety we should use, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 varieties fine. You know, putting too many varieties, making a beer kind of, how do you call it, not focused, unfocused, like, you know, some citrus, some grapefruit, some, you know, passion fruit, and kind of stuff. People want more, you know, straightforward, understandable, you know, kind of fruity IPA kind of stuff. I think so. 3, 4 varieties, you know, good numbers.
Thank you for your answer. So what about you, Andrew? What's your take on this?
We have a product called Newing, and I don't know if it was out of necessity, probably out of necessity. Our New England, we tend to use more than one anyways. The science guy in me wants to use just one so I can drink it and then figure out what it produces, even though I see things on the chart and what it should produce. But we've always used 2, 3, sometimes 4. There was one variety of Newing that we had 25, just to see what happened.
25 varieties in one batch.
Yes, we had a very large collection of YCH samples that we went through for one batch, and it was a very interesting beer. but I agree with Yamada-san in that if you have too many, it takes away from the identity of the beer. So yeah, one can be fantastic. We've had some really great beer that we just used one hop in the dry hop, and then we've had 3 or 4 that have been also fantastic. So I don't think there's one rule for this. I think too many is too expensive, of course, and too few could lead to some problems with being too boring, but they all produce really great beers, in my opinion.
Gotcha. Thank you.
David, before we move on to the next question, I'd like to ask the panelists, what kind of techniques do you guys find works best for dry hopping mid-fermentation? Do you go by days of fermentation, or do you like to do it at certain Plato? Start with John. You don't have to tell us anything that's proprietary.
No, nothing proprietary here. I think we usually go by gravity for us. Yeah, usually. But you know what? It's quite consistent. Usually, we know that at certain hours, it should more or less hit certain what you call gravity. But activity as well. We don't really want to put it in when it could be a little bit too vigorous in terms of yeah, that's right. Yeah, so we got to be fast and, you know, do it swiftly, you know, and yeah, that's usually what we shoot for the first edition. That's right.
So John, you can point the next one to answer this question. Or
okay.
just like, okay, your turn.
Yeah, Andrew. How did you add the 25 hops? And when you said 25 hops, Percy was very happy.
Yeah, it was great because they were all free hops. That was the #1 thing. But we generally do the same thing. We'll go in at between 20 and 30 but being very careful depending on how much we're adding. If we know, if it's more than 10 kilos, we know we're not going to have much time to put that in there before it explodes at that gravity. It depends what yeast we're using too. If we've got a very fast acting Kvike, then the window of getting in between 20 and 30 is closed pretty quickly, sometimes while you're sleeping. But yeah, generally at that point, we tend to add it in. We're not too concerned if it gets in under 20, but in the teens, as long as it's still active at the end of fermentation. But those 25 hops, we very quickly open the packs and put them into big containers and then dump them in. It was great. It was a lot of fun, actually.
So I think right now let's go to Yamada-san about this question.
Yep. So for us, almost the same. So we watch the gravity. 2025 is the ideal, gravity for putting the first dry hop. But the thing is, as Andrew said, it's very difficult to set the working hour for specific gravity like 2025. So sometimes it's at night and midnight or something. So we don't have any night shift currently. So sometimes we put earlier, like 30 or 35. Sometimes we put 15 or something. We want to, set the, gravity, but it's so far difficult because, employees have to sleep. But for the sake of consistency, I agree that we, set the, the point of the gravity like 20 or 25, 30, either way.
What we try to do is also really look at the activity, not just gushing, right? But sometimes if we add it a little bit too active, and even after we shut it, you would see that along the rim of the fermenter, it leaves behind a whole lot of hops there. So you question like how much actually made its way into the beer and how much is actually left, like on just on the side of the fermenter. So we want to put as much hops in the beer. Yeah.
Thank you all for the answers. Josh, any questions? You're on mute.
You're on mute.
You guys hear me yet?
Right now, yes.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
Just to add a point to what John was saying, especially in terms of safety, what we would do is we had an extra valve.
You're on mute again.
Okay, how's that?
Jim, you need to unmute your computer, please.
Sorry
Thank
about
you.
that.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Loud and clear.
Okay. Sorry. Again, to John's point about safety, what we would do is we had an extra valve that we would use at the top of the tank. It would be autoclaved. We'd put that on. We'd add 10% of that mid-firm charge, close the tank. There would be a big eruption, wait 10 minutes, and then you can have the full charge and you wouldn't have any foaming over. That gave us, you wouldn't see any of the ringing of the hops. It's also a lot safer for your brewers.
That's a very good tip. So let's move on to the next question about temperature. So Josh, do we have a best temperature for maximizing the biotransformation? And this question I would also like to ask the panelists is, how would you usually dry hop at the temperature? So Josh.
So I'm going to say Fahrenheit because I don't know how to convert to Celsius, but we would always dry hop at fermentation temperatures, whether that was ale or lagers. Just because we would be turning tanks so fast, we couldn't really play around with doing colder fermentations. We need to really turn those tanks around, keep our production schedule up. So we would normally dry hop at 66 to 68 Fahrenheit. and just not deviate from that just for consistency.
So 66 Fahrenheit, that is 18, 19 Celsius. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you.
Around that temperature. I mean, for ales, right?
For ales. One day I will learn how to convert these from Fahrenheit to Celsius. I should know how to do that. And for the way we would dry hop, again, I would wait till 7 Plato. We had the benefit of working 3 shifts, so there was always somebody there. But we always did it at 7 Plato. Again, we'd add the 10%, wait 10 minutes, and then add the additional charge. And then we would also dry hop at the end of fermentation with 1 Plato left in fermentation, because we felt that the yeast would help mix the hops and hopefully get just a touch more biotransformation out of it.
Josh, Josh, can I check when you said 7 Plato, right? Irregardless of how high you start, whether it's a 6% IPA or a double, do you go by a percentage of fermentation, or you just usually stick to 7 Plato before you add your hops in there?
We played around with doing it at different gravities, but just because we were moving so fast, tanks had to get turned. We just made a boilerplate 7 Plato gravity, and we always had great results doing that.
So meaning that even though you start with a very high FG and then always 6, it's not like always, just it's kind of like a sweet spot.
Yeah, I would say if you're going to really like try to look at it on a bell curve, it would be after the most active part of fermentation. Once it starts to settle down, that's when I like to add it.
Gotcha. So you want to point one panelist to answer this question?
Go ahead, Andrew.
What was the question?
The question is, what's the dry hopping temperature and what do you prefer at?
Very similar, but we use Kvike in some of our beers, and we've done it at 35 degrees, and we've lowered it down to the ale temperature of 1920 before we've done it, and we haven't noticed a huge difference between the two, but again, we haven't done it that often. But I'm just like Josh, we have a limited number of tanks, and so it's, you know, if it's at ale temperature, just dropping it and waiting until that next shift to do it. Sometimes we don't have time. We got to turn the tanks around, so we've done most of the dry hopping at the fermentation temperatures that are going on.
I think one important thing to note, the advantage of doing it at fermentation temperature is it helps prevent any further hop creep later, right? So I think if you dry hop it too cold or on the colder side, you know, and you package it over time, you know, certain enzymes from the hops could still, I mean, if you've not filtered the beers, and if, you know, hop creep could be an issue later.
Yeah, we've always been worried about that since we've been heavily into packaging, so we've focused on that as well.
So 35 is pretty high, right? I mean, higher than 35 degree.
Yeah, I mean, Kvike is kind of a magical thing. It's pretty amazing what it does. The only thing that worries me is that with Kvike, there's a very limited amount of phenols being produced. I can't detect any at any stage of fermentation, even though, I mean, it's so quick. It's within 2 days and it's done. So I wonder how much biotransformation occurs because of that lack of phenols being in the process of fermentation. But they always turned out to be really wonderful beers. I like Kvike a lot.
So did you compare this Kvike with other variety like ale strain?
Sure,
So
sure. There's, especially for our New England, we're always considering about a lot of things, just like most brewers. You're not just focusing on the aroma and the flavor, you're also focusing on retaining the haze. It's kind of a funny thing. in the past, you're always making clear beers. And you're like, okay, we got to make this clear. It can't be hazy. But then when you go to make a hazy beer, sometimes it goes a little too clear. And so it's quite complicated these days. Those factors that you're considering, we've looked at using Kveik at that temperature and how effective it is at keeping the haze and how effective it's not compared to some of the ale yeasts. And we're always just trying something new. That's what's the nice thing about our New England. Our customers don't expect the same one each time. It's not about it's just a name, it's just a brand, but every time you have it, it's gonna have a different focus, whether it's the yeast or the hops, because I'm always looking to improve. I think the core beers, your clear ones, your lagers and your pale ales and your basic IPAs, I think those can have the consistency that they need, but New Englands are great to play with.
Gotcha. So Yamada-san, would you share with us about your experience?
The dry hop temperature?
Yes.
It depending on the fermentation temperature, depending on the yeast we use. Normally we use the flagship yeast from Imperial Yeast. For that case, 18 to 20 degrees. Sometimes we use the farmhouse yeast, higher temperature like 24, 25. Both cases, work very well, I think. We've never done with Kveik based yet. Very interesting. So Andrew, do you reuse Kveik yeast often? How do you handle the Kveik yeast when like propagation or something like that?
Yeah, sometimes we've tried to crop it, but if you've got too many hops from your whirlpool and too many hops, it's almost impossible to crop that kind of yeast. It's useless. So you either have to be on top of it really quick to crop it and reuse, for 3 or 4 generations. And we haven't noticed any drop off in the effectiveness as long as we follow those guidelines. It's just all about being able to get it out of the tank with less hop material and getting into the next one with that hop material, just because it clogs everything up. But yeah, Kveik is a survivor. I mean, if you've watched any of the things from Norway about what they do, I mean, they have basically just a bamboo circle that they dip into the beer and hang it in their farm, and that's what they use for the next batch. It's pretty amazing. But those strains, of course, have over 100 different Kveiks on that bamboo wheel, whereas we're getting, a very isolated strain of either Voss or on. So I don't think it has the survivability that those guys do. But yeah, it's an interesting yeast.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, I'd like to try it. Thank you.
Okay, so John, would you like to talk something about the dry hopping temperature?
For us, we dry hop about a fermentation temperature, so anywhere between 16 to 18. Just something that I brought along from my home brewing days. I find that better extraction of flavors that I want. I particularly don't really like flavors that's being extracted when it's on the colder side. Just seems like certain hop oils are not as soluble on the cold side. Then things like it helps to when it's still active fermentation, it helps to scrub up any oxygen or DO in there as well. And then more importantly these days is it helps to make sure that we avoid hop creep in the bottles, or especially in a can where the can could swell, right? Then that could be an issue downstream. So we make, because every time after we dry hop, we see the gravity drop probably half a Plato or something, and that could add considerable amounts of carbonation to your bottles or cans. Yeah, so on the safe side, we prefer it on the fermentation temperature, Celsius wise, 16 to 18, somewhere about there. Because for the non NEIPAs, the NEIPAs, we usually take it off the yeast. So we put it sometimes at 16 degrees, and then we take some yeast off the beer, because we don't want too much of the hop oils binding with some of the yeast as well, right? So it kind of helps retain more flavor and aroma. Yeah.
Understood. So, okay, I think it went well. It's like you answer some questions and you have questions for other brewers. That's a very good model today. I think that's good. So do we have any questions for each other?
I don't know who want to answer this, but I'm curious about the biotransformation of other types of yeast. Since we do barrel aging, and we put some Brettanomyces, and sometimes we do very something like spontaneous fermentation with wild yeast. We have tried barrel aged, how do you call it, the dry hopped barrel aged sour. That works. We put something like a Simcoe and Citra on it, and it works. And then the hop aroma is kind of different from the Saccharomyces beer. I'm just curious about if anyone have ever done the, ever tried a biotransformation with other kind of yeast.
We've got a barrel age program here, and not a significant amount of barrels, but there are some that we've done that with, and they're still in the barrels now. Anything with the barrel age, because of this whole COVID thing, we had a grand plan 2 years ago, but we can't release as many as we want to every couple months. But I do agree with the burn. It seems to be more significant if you're using any kind of Brettanomyces. We only use that on our sour barrel aging side. On our imperial stout side, we don't use any of that stuff. We just tend to put the adjuncts in after it's reached the taste flavor profile that we want. We'll put it into our bright tank and then add certain things that we want to happen in there, but no further yeast additions. But the hop burn is always something that's put me off at that late stage of putting something in.
Do you usually do a bottle condition for this kind of barrel aging beer?
We've done both. Sometimes it was out of necessity that we do the bottle aging. We do that. We've done that with the sour barrel aging with more success. With the imperials in whiskey and bourbon barrels, we've tended to put that into the bright tank. We find that it has a much better success rate. And because the imperial FGs are much higher, I think if there's a lot of danger of doing some bottle conditioning with those beers, I'd rather do it in the bright tank and get any last little bit of danger out of there. Exploding bottles is nasty. But yeah, we did it for the sours and it worked really well. There's a certain yeast conditioning packet that we use to add, and it's always, we've never had any problem with anything exploding after that.
So I have a question. We have a question here regarding to oxidation. So as I think both of us know that people start doing packaging like canning or bottling So is there any way to avoid the oxidation in this process? So Josh, would you like to touch on this a little bit? You're on mute again.
How's that?
Very good.
Sorry,
Right now.
technical problems. I've heard anecdotally some breweries would, when they would fob their bottles or cans, they would put citric acid in their fob water. Citric acid is technically an antioxidant, but I personally would never do that. I think the best way to control your DO levels are to really standardize your process and check it at every step.
Okay. So, John, do you have any take on this about avoiding oxidation?
I think I read the question. The question specifically was asking about using antioxidants. So I think there are brewers who add things to the beer. You know, like certain products like Vacant, which is basically some sulfites in there to help scrub oxygen or over time in the package. Yeah, so there are products out there for such purposes. Whether you use it or it's really down to but I think in the States it's if you put sulfites in any in any product, as long as it's below 10 ppm, you don't have to say that it contains sulfites. So I know brewers who use them, but yeah.
You don't.
I don't. Yeah, not yet, or at least we don't. I think because the style of beer is just very unforgiving, right? It's meant to be drunk very fresh. So I don't think it's the style of beer that you want to put a year on the package. You know, with or without the chemicals, I don't think it tastes nice. A hazy IPA in 9 months or 12 months. Yeah. So.
Okay. So Yamada-san, have you used any products, or how do you avoid the oxidation in beer packaging?
You know, with our current facility, we just do the standard procedure to avoid, you know, oxidation. You know, controlling the contact time of the dry hop, that's one thing. The other thing is, so we do centrifuge after, you know, before filling. You know, we just measure DO, you know, before and after centrifuge, and check if we, you know, picked up any, you know, oxidation, you know, when transferring, you know, fermenter to you know, BBT. Other stuff is, you know, we often, you know, measure DO, you know, after packaging and after, you know, actually, yeah, we do, normally we do a bottle condition and can condition for almost all products. So that's why right after canning, we have some oxygen, like 20 ppb or something. But after the second fermentation finished inside the package, we normally have 0 ppb oxygen. So we do a tasting panel, you know, just after the second fermentation, and how the you know, T2N level, how much T2N we can detect or something. So in, you know, in summary, just checking, testing, doing the standard procedure that's we are doing.
Okay, thank you. What about Guerrilla? Andrew, do you have any experience using it?
I agree with Yamada-san. It's all based mostly on your SOP for your canning and your bottling setup. We have a guy that did it in Taiwan for years, so we brought him here to run that operation. And my limited experience with it, what I've noticed for the most important thing for him is to have that, because all the machines provide a blanket of CO2, especially the canner. And as long as you've got enough going through there and you're following your procedure well for canning and bottling, you're not going to pick up much. We've tested quite a few of ours after the fact, and it's really, really low. But other than that, yeah, doing your dry hop quickly, but as long as you've got a blanket of CO2 going in and coming out as you're putting in the hops, I don't think you're going to pick up anything either. So yeah, just good, solid SOPs.
Thank you all for your input. Okay, so another question. This is might be not related to the practical side, but the COA interpretation. So, Josh, I would like to say, so does that mean myrcene and farnesene are not the index that we should be looking at anymore? If we have those 7 figures figured out and put that into the biotransformation chart. So does that mean if we're reading the COA, we can skip those?
I would say the short answer is yes. The longer answer is I'm not sure, because there's a lot of research still to be done. There's a lot of compounds in hops. We're not sure how myrcene might interact with other compounds, but I can say that any compound that ends with -ene, so myrcene, caryophyllene, farnesene, you will not find those very often in finished beer because they are not water soluble. So if you use products in the whirlpool or mid-fermentation, any compound that ends with -ene will not survive heat or CO2 scrubbing or yeast interaction. So usually when I look at the C of A, I like to look at total oil content, HSI, linalool and draniol are usually the 2 that I'm really looking at. Gotcha. Yeah, we have a saying here: if it ends with -ene, it won't make the scene.
That's from Pat, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, Andrew,
I have a question. Yeah, for Josh. Using hops, we've got all this biotransformation information provided by YCH, which is great. What about if you're using oil?
Like hot side oil?
Both, either the hot side oil in the whirlpool, and if you are brave enough to add it on the dry hop side.
So I'll say that almost every product on the market is full spectrum distillate, meaning that they pull every single compound out of that. So you're getting, I mean, myrcene can make up to 75% of your total oil content. That's not really something that you want to see in your finished beer. Yeah. So I think for hot side, CO2 extracts are totally fine. I think they work great because they'll get the heat and the yeast interaction. But I've seen some cold side products that were myrcene bombs, and you just be burping it up the whole time.
The hot side additions that we've done with oil, we've noticed a really large pool of oil sometimes just sitting on top of the beer after the whirlpool addition. And it just kind of floats down as you're transferring, and some, if not a lot, gets, depending on your whirlpool setup and your kettle setup, gets kind of trapped to one side. It doesn't really blend into the beer very well.
Personally, that might not be a terrible thing. I think you've probably already extracted all your soluble compounds. Keep that oil from ruining your head retention.
Good. Thank you.
Hey, cool. So do we have more questions here? No.
Do any of the other panelists have any experience using CO2 extracts in the whirlpool?
We do that mainly for our double IPAs, just getting enough IBUs into solution, because otherwise we find that we don't get as much utilization with T90s at a very high gravity. So we use CO2 extract for that. So far we have not had that much an oil like Andrew floating on top. Usually it's quite soluble. And thankfully, because otherwise cleaning out the kettle or the whirlpool would be a nightmare because it can be quite sticky. But so far, okay. I've got a question though, like on for Josh on the cold side. I see some products coming out these days, and one of the reasons I'm asking is because we do centrifuge some of our IPAs, and we do lose quite a bit sometimes of hop aroma and flavor post-huge. And we were thinking about, are there possibilities of adding it back into the brights after that? Just to add a little bit more back in it. I mean, it's great after the fuge. It tastes really clean. It takes some of harshness out of the beer. But we're just thinking whether we could just, add a little shine back to the beer after that.
YCH doesn't currently offer any water-soluble cold side hop products. One thing that we did when we centrifuged to improve the aroma was to pull out of the bottom of the tank at about 20% while we're pulling out of the racking arm. So we would spin the hops out as much as we could, try to extract as much of the beer out of the actual plant material as possible.
Okay, so does anyone has any questions? If not, I think we're going to wrap up today's event. And Jim, would you like to say something about today?
Sure. First of all, a sincere thanks to our panelists, Shiro, Yamada, John Way, and Andrew Gamble for your time. Also to David Hsu as a co-host with Josh Viersbacher, and to Brian, and for all of you that took your time out of your day to watch this. This is something we like to provide. We also want to make sure that it's relevant. And so any questions, comments, you have our emails and addresses, don't hesitate to let us know so we can get this information back to you. Josh is part of our also part of our technical improvement team. And so we're always anxious to get more feedback. That being said, on behalf of my colleague, Percy Lamb, who's the VP of Sales for Asia, we wish you all a very pleasant rest of the week. And again, a sincere thanks for your time. Have a good day.
Thanks, guys.
You guys.